The coffee was still steaming when it hit her face. For one full second, nobody in that restaurant moved. Forks froze halfway to open mouths. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes stopped so abruptly the glasses trembled, and in the center of it all stood a young waitress named Marin Cole. Her white uniform blouse soaked dark brown, her skin turning red beneath it, her hands shaking at her sides, because some instinct told her that flinching, that crying out, that doing anything at all would only make it worse. The woman who had thrown the coffee stood over her, chest heaving, diamonds flashing under the chandelier light, lips curled into something between fury and disgust. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she hissed. "Do you have any idea whose restaurant this is?" Marin opened her mouth to apologize, even though, moments earlier, all she had done was set down a coffee cup, a half-second too close to the woman's Chanel bag. That was the entire offense, a half-inch of proximity, and now her arm was burning, her dignity was burning, and 30 strangers were pulling out their phones instead of pulling out their chairs to help her. Nobody in that dining room knew, in that exact moment, that the story circulating out of this 5-star restaurant in downtown Manhattan by morning would not be about a spilled drink. It would be about a marriage collapsing in real time, because right as the woman opened her mouth to scream something even crueler, the heavy glass doors at the entrance swung open, and the man walking through them owned every square inch of the building they were standing in. His name was Julian Ashford, and, until that night, almost no one in that room had ever seen him lose his composure. Not once. Not during the hostile takeover attempt 3 years earlier that nearly gutted his hotel empire. Not during the congressional hearing where reporters tried to bait him into a soundbite. Julian Ashford was, by every account, the calmest man in any room he entered. That was about to change. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Marin Cole actually was, because the restaurant staff, and even Julian's own wife, only saw a 26-year-old woman in a black apron refilling water glasses for a living. They had no idea she was working 2 jobs, that she caught the 5:40 a.m. bus every morning to make it to nursing school lectures before her afternoon shift, or that she had a 7-year-old son at home named Eli who needed a second surgery on his hip, that her insurance only partially covered. They did not know that she had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 8 months, or that she smiled through every shift anyway, because smiling was the only currency she had left to spend on hope. They also did not know, and this detail matters more than any other, that 11 years earlier, when Marin was 15 years old, and her father had just died of a heart attack with no life insurance and no savings, a scholarship fund quietly paid for the rest of her high school tuition, her books, and even her prom dress, so she wouldn't have to drop out to work full-time. That scholarship fund had been started by a young hotel executive who had grown up poor himself, a man who never let his name be attached publicly to the donation, because he remembered exactly what it felt like to be handed charity with someone else's ego stapled to it. That man was Julian Ashford. He did not know, walking through those glass doors that night, that the trembling waitress across the room was the same girl who had once mailed his foundation a handwritten thank-you letter, so heartfelt that his assistant had printed it and pinned it to the corkboard behind his desk, where it still hung today. He simply saw a woman in pain, and his wife standing over her, and 30 phones recording the wreckage. "Vivian," his voice was quiet. That was the terrifying part. It was quiet. "What did you just do?" Vivian Ashford turned, and, for half a second, something flickered across her face. Something close to panic, before it hardened back into composure. She had married Julian 6 years earlier, back when the tabloids called them a fairy tale, the scrappy hotel mogul and the elegant socialite. What the tabloids never printed was that Vivian had grown increasingly obsessed with what she called standards. a word she used to justify screaming at valets, sending back food that looked perfectly fine, and once, famously, having a hotel manager fired because the thread count on her pillowcase felt, in her words, insulting. She was clumsy, Vivienne said, straightening her spine, recalculating fast. She nearly ruined a $6,000 handbag, Julian, I reacted. Any reasonable person would have reacted. Behind her, Maren stood frozen, coffee still dripping from her sleeve onto the marble floor, watching the man who owned the building. Study his wife with an expression that had gone somewhere cold and very far away. Any reasonable person, Julian repeated slowly, would have said, "Excuse me," not thrown scalding coffee on another human being. A manager, a nervous man named Doyle, who had worked at the restaurant for 9 years, hurried over, wringing his hands, clearly torn between protecting an employee and protecting his job, because everyone in that room understood the unspoken hierarchy. Vivienne Ashford was the boss's wife. Nobody crossed her. Nobody ever had. "Mr. Ashford, I can explain." There was a small accident. "We can move Mrs. Ashford to another table. Get her a doctor," Julian said, cutting him off, nodding toward Maren, without even looking away from his wife. "Now, and someone get her something for the burn, ice, whatever we have." It was such a small sentence, but it landed in that dining room like a gunshot. Because, for 6 years, every single person in Julian Ashford's orbit had learned to prioritize his wife's comfort above everyone else's, including, occasionally, their own safety. And here he was, in front of witnesses, in front of phones that were absolutely still recording, choosing the waitress. Vivienne's mouth opened. "Julian, you're embarrassing me." In front of, "You embarrassed yourself," he said. "I'm just the first person tonight willing to say it out loud." Maren, still trembling, still in pain, still trying to process the fact that the most powerful man in the New York hospitality industry was standing 4 feet away from her. Defending her, finally found her voice. "Sir, it's okay, really. I should have been more careful with the—" "Don't do that," Julian said, and his tone softened the moment he turned to her. So completely different from the ice he'd used on his wife that it startled her. "Don't apologize for something that was done to you." "What's your name?" "Maren," she said quietly. "Maren Cole." Something shifted behind his eyes. It was faint, almost nothing, the kind of flicker you'd miss if you weren't looking directly at him. But Maren saw it, a recognition trying to surface, and not quite finding its way to the front of his mind yet. He would not place it fully until 3 days later, sitting in his office at 2 in the morning, going through old scholarship files because something about her name had been nagging at him since the moment she said it. And there it was, buried in a decade-old folder. Maren Cole, class of applicants, father deceased, top of her class, the handwritten letter still pinned behind him on the corkboard the entire time. But that night, all he knew was that his wife had just poured scalding coffee on a woman who did not deserve it, in front of a room full of witnesses, in his own restaurant, on what was supposed to be their 6th wedding anniversary dinner. He had walked in 15 minutes early with a small velvet box in his jacket pocket. A pair of earrings he'd spent 3 weeks choosing. And instead, he'd walked into this. "I want the security footage pulled," Julian told Doyle, his voice back to business, sharp and final. "Every camera angle. Tonight. Julian, this is absurd," Vivienne snapped, her composure cracking further, voices around them dropping to hushed whispers. "You're going to review security tape over a waitress? People are staring at us." "People have been staring at you scream at staff members for 6 years," Julian said. "I was just too busy running a company to notice how often." That sentence would come back to haunt her, because it wasn't entirely true. He had noticed. He had chosen, for years, to look away, telling himself it was easier. That confrontation would cost him more than it was worth. That maybe he was exaggerating how bad it really was. Watching Marin's arm turn an angrier shade of red in real time erased every excuse he had ever made for his wife in one blinding instant. What none of them knew yet, not Julian, not Vivian, not the dozens of phones still recording, was that this footage would be uploaded within the hour by a stunned diner sitting 2 tables away, and by morning it would have 4 million views, and by that evening 11 million, with a headline that read, "Billionaire's wife throws coffee on waitress, doesn't know husband is watching." Vivian's world began cracking apart in ways far larger than a viral video, though, because when Julian pulled that security footage that night, staying in his office until nearly 4 in the morning, he did not stop at reviewing the coffee incident. He kept scrolling backward, through weeks of footage across 3 properties, and what he found chilled him far more than a single outburst. He found Vivian meeting, repeatedly, at odd hours, in a private dining room at another Ashford hotel, with Preston Cole, the company's chief financial officer. Not business meetings, not board discussions, long dinners that stretched past midnight, hands lingering a beat too long across the table, a kiss caught at the edge of one grainy frame that made Julian's stomach drop straight through the floor. He sat alone in that office, the city glittering silently outside his window, and felt something in his chest that was not quite heartbreak and not quite rage, but a strange, exhausted mixture of both. The particular grief of realizing you have been slowly lied to for a very long time and simply hadn't wanted to see it. He didn't confront her that night. He was too disciplined for that, too used to moving carefully when the stakes were high. Instead, he called his lawyer at 6 in the morning and quietly began pulling financial records. What he found over the following week was worse than infidelity. Vivian and Preston had been funneling money through a shell vendor contract, inflating invoices for event planning services that barely existed, siphoning nearly $2.3 million out of the company over 18 months. Preston had access. Vivian had motive. Together, they'd built a small, elegant theft, disguised behind flower arrangements and catering fees. When Julian finally sat his wife down, 5 days after the coffee incident, in the quiet of their Fifth Avenue penthouse, he didn't raise his voice. He simply placed a folder on the glass table between them and slid it toward her. "I gave you 6 years," he said. "I gave you my name, my trust, and apparently, according to this folder, $2.3 million, you didn't think I'd notice." Vivian stared at the documents, her face draining of color. All the practiced composure finally, completely gone. "Julian, I can explain." "You explained enough on video," he said quietly. "The whole world watched you explain exactly who you are." She tried anger next, then tears, then something colder. Threats about the prenup, about what a divorce would do to his public image, about how ugly she could make this. Julian let her finish every word before he answered. "I built this company from nothing," he said. "I've survived worse threats than you. What I can't survive is looking at you every morning, knowing what you did to that woman, and what you did to me, and pretending I don't." The divorce filing went public 9 days later, the same week the coffee video crossed 30 million views. But the story the public actually fell in love with wasn't Vivian's downfall. It was what happened to Marin. Julian had personally covered her medical treatment that first night, a minor burn that healed within 2 weeks, physically at least. But he did something else too, something that never made it fully into any headline, because he asked the foundation to keep it quiet. He tracked down her old scholarship file, confirmed what his gut had been telling him since the night she said her name, and personally paid for the remainder of her son Eli's surgery, along with her final year of nursing school tuition in full. When he finally told her, sitting across from her in a quiet corner booth of that same restaurant 3 weeks later, her hands flew to her mouth. And for the first time since the night of the coffee, she cried. Not from pain this time, but from something that felt, after 11 years of barely staying afloat, dangerously close to relief. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. "You wrote me a letter when you were 15. Julian said gently, sliding a worn, yellowed piece of paper across the table. The same handwritten note that had hung behind his desk for over a decade. "You said the scholarship didn't just pay for school. You said it proved someone out there still believed strangers were worth helping. I think it's time I proved that to you again." Marin looked down at her own handwriting, words she had written as a grieving teenager who never imagined the man reading them would still have them memorized 11 years later. And she laughed through her tears, the kind of laugh that only comes after you've cried the ugly kind first. 6 months later, Marin graduated top of her nursing class. Eli walked without a limp for the first time in 3 years, and the video of a billionaire's wife throwing coffee on a stranger had become something else entirely online, a story people cited not for the cruelty in it, but for what came after. Proof. Endlessly reshared. That decency still occasionally wins, and that sometimes the person you humiliate in public turns out to be someone somebody else has been quietly rooting for all along. Julian never spoke publicly about his divorce, and he never framed what he did for Marin as an act of charity, because, to him, it never was. It was simply a debt, finally repaid, to the one person who had once believed in him before he had a single dollar to his name, to prove he deserved it. And on quiet nights, long after the cameras had moved on to the next scandal, the next headline, the next viral clip, Marin still kept that letter, and Julian still remembered the exact sound of coffee hitting the floor. The moment that, for all its pain, finally showed him the difference between the people who use power to make others feel small and the people who never forget what it felt like to have none.